You think you know trauma better than someone who lived it. The words hung in the sterile air of the psychiatric ward conference room like a challenge. Dr. Rebecca Foster, Chief of Psychiatry at Veterans Memorial Hospital, stood at the doorway, her expression unreadable. Before her, a group of third-year medical students surrounded an elderly man in a wheelchair, their voices dripping with academic condescension. What happened next would shatter everything these future doctors thought they knew about courage, sacrifice, and the true cost of serving your country. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Conference Room B cast a harsh, clinical glow over the polished mahogany table. It was Tuesday afternoon at Veterans Memorial Hospital in Richmond, Virginia, and the psychiatric rotation for Johns Hopkins medical students was in full swing. 7 third-year students sat arranged around the table, their laptops open, tablets glowing, reference books stacked like small fortresses of medical knowledge. At the head of the table stood Marcus Chen, the unofficial leader of the group. His designer glasses caught the light as he gestured to the presentation on the screen behind him. He was brilliant, everyone knew it, and he made sure they never forgot it. His white coat was crisp, his stethoscope draped with calculated casualness around his neck, and his confidence filled the room like expensive cologne. "The case study for today," Marcus announced, tapping his laser pointer against the screen, involves classical PTSD presentation with what I believe are clear malingering indicators. Patient exhibits textbook avoidance behaviors, but the timeline inconsistencies suggest fabrication or, at minimum, severe exaggeration for secondary gain. The other students nodded, taking notes. Sarah Williams, a sharp-featured woman with her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, raised her hand. "The VA disability angle?" "Exactly," Marcus replied with a knowing smirk. "These cases are unfortunately common. Patient seeks diagnosis, gets rated for disability compensation, and suddenly symptoms that were manageable become catastrophic. It's a studied phenomenon." The door to the conference room opened with a soft click that barely registered above the hum of the air conditioning. A hospital orderly, a young man named David Martinez, wheeled in a patient. The wheelchair's rubber wheels made almost no sound on the polished floor. The man in the wheelchair was old, not just elderly but ancient in the way that combat veterans sometimes appear, as if they'd lived multiple lifetimes in a single span of years. His name was James Edward Sullivan, though the chart simply read J. Sullivan, 79 years old. He wore a simple gray cardigan over a blue button-down shirt, khaki pants, and worn brown shoes that had seen better decades. His hands, gnarled and marked with old scars, rested quietly in his lap. But it was his eyes that told the real story. They were a faded green, like sea glass worn smooth by endless waves, and they held a distant quality, as if part of him was perpetually somewhere else, somewhere far away and long ago. Marcus barely glanced at the old man as David positioned the wheelchair near the corner of the room. "Park him over there," Marcus said dismissively, waving his hand toward the wall. "We'll get to the interview portion shortly." David hesitated, his jaw tightening. He'd worked at Veterans Memorial for 3 years, and he'd learned to recognize the men and women who deserved respect. Something about Mr. Sullivan commanded it, even in silence. But David was just an orderly. He had no authority here. He locked the wheelchair's brakes and left the room, throwing one last concerned glance at the old veteran. Marcus turned back to his presentation, clicking to the next slide. "So, as I was saying, the patient claims acute traumatic episodes from service in Vietnam, but notice here," he pointed to a line in the digital medical record projected on the screen, "the documentation is sparse, very few specific details, lots of vague references to classified missions and operations he can't discuss. Classic evasion tactics." "Couldn't some operations actually be classified?" asked Tommy Richardson, a quieter student with red hair and freckles, his southern accent soft but present. Marcus rolled his eyes. Tommy, we're talking about events from 50-plus years ago. Declassification happens. If it were real, there'd be documentation by now. This is clearly a defensive mechanism to avoid scrutiny of his claims. Around the table, most of the students nodded in agreement. This made sense. They'd been taught to look for inconsistencies, to question narratives that didn't align with evidence-based medicine. Critical thinking was the cornerstone of their education. Sarah leaned forward, studying the chart on her tablet. His medication compliance is also problematic. He's refused the last 3 prescriptions for SSRIs. That's non-adherence to treatment protocol. How can we assess efficacy if the patient won't even try the standard interventions? Another red flag, Marcus agreed. Genuine PTSD patients want help. They're desperate for relief. But malingerers, they need to maintain their symptoms to maintain their story. He said this loudly enough that there was no question the old man in the corner could hear every word. James Sullivan sat motionless in his wheelchair. His face revealed nothing. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself, didn't even seem to register the accusations being casually thrown around the room. His eyes remained fixed on a spot on the wall, that 1,000-yard stare that the students had read about in textbooks but couldn't truly comprehend. Elena Vasquez, a studious woman with dark hair and kind eyes, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Something about this felt wrong. She'd grown up in a military family. Her father had served in the Navy, and she'd seen what real trauma looked like. It wasn't something you performed. It was something you survived. But she was new to the group, and Marcus had already established the hierarchy. She stayed silent. Marcus walked closer to James, his expensive shoes clicking on the floor. He stopped a few feet away, looking down at the old man with the clinical detachment of someone examining a lab specimen. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, his voice taking on that carefully modulated tone medical students use when addressing patients they consider unreliable. "Can you tell us about these missions you claim to have been on, the ones you say are classified?" James slowly turned his head to look at Marcus. For a moment, something flickered in those sea-glass eyes. Not anger, not even indignation, something deeper, something that made Marcus unconsciously take a half-step back. "I don't claim anything, son," James said quietly. His voice was rough, like gravel being slowly turned in a riverbed. "I just live with what happened." Marcus recovered his composure quickly, a practiced smile sliding across his face. Of course, but you understand our position, Mr. Sullivan. We're physicians in training. We need verifiable information to make proper diagnoses. Your refusal to provide specific details, your rejection of proven pharmaceutical interventions, your convenient memory gaps." He turned to address the other students. "These are all consistent with factitious disorder or malingering." "I remember everything," James said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow cutting through Marcus's speech. "That's the problem." Sarah jumped in, her tone professional but edged with skepticism. "Then help us understand, Mr. Sullivan. Give us specifics, dates, locations, unit designations, something we can verify. Otherwise, how do we separate legitimate trauma from—" She paused, choosing her words carefully, "elaboration." James turned his gaze to her. "Some things aren't in your computers," he said simply. "Some things were never meant to be written down." Marcus actually laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed in the conference room. "That's incredibly convenient, isn't it? The dog ate my homework, military edition." A few students snickered, though Elena and Tommy looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Let me guess," Marcus continued, warming to his performance. "You were a Special Forces, Delta, a SEAL before there were SEALs? Let me tell you what I think, Mr. Sullivan. I think you're a veteran, yes. I think you served, probably in some support capacity, but I think over the years, the stories got bigger. The trauma got more dramatic, and now here you are with a narrative that can't be questioned because it's all conveniently classified. The room fell silent. James Sullivan didn't react with the anger or defensiveness Marcus expected. Instead, the old man simply closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, he was somewhere else entirely. The conference room faded. The harsh fluorescent lights became the dappled shadows of a triple canopy jungle. The air conditioning's hum transformed into the screech of monkeys and the drone of insects. James was 23 years old again, his face streaked with camouflage paint, his hands steady on a suppressed rifle. Around him, 5 other men moved through the jungle like ghosts, each step placed with absolute precision. They had no names here, no ranks, no official existence. The target compound was 2 clicks ahead. Their mission was simple in description, impossible in execution. Extract a captured CIA operative before the North Vietnamese could move him to Hanoi. If they failed, the man would be paraded as a spy, creating an international incident. If they succeeded, it would never be acknowledged. If they died, they would be labeled deserters. "Contact front," came the whispered voice of Rodriguez through the radio. The jungle erupted in gunfire. James blinked, and he was back in the conference room. The whole flashback had lasted perhaps 3 seconds. His hands, resting in his lap, trembled almost imperceptibly. Marcus was still talking, something about diagnostic criteria and burden of proof. Sarah was nodding along, but Elena was watching James's hands. She saw the tremor. She saw something else, too, a distant recognition that this wasn't an act. This was a man reliving something real. The door to the conference room opened again. This time, it wasn't an orderly. Dr. Rebecca Foster, Chief of Psychiatry, stood in the doorway. She was in her late 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a simple clip. She wore a white coat over a navy blouse and gray plants. Her expression was controlled, but her eyes held a storm. "Dr. Chen," she said quietly. The room froze. Marcus turned, his confident smile faltering slightly. When the Chief of Psychiatry used your title, even your student title, with that particular tone, nothing good followed. "Dr. Foster," Marcus recovered. "We were just conducting our case study analysis with Mr. Sullivan here. Fascinating presentation of claimed PTSD with multiple inconsistencies that—" "Step outside," Dr. Foster said. "It wasn't a request. All of you, now." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The 7 medical students filed out of Conference Room B like school children called to the principal's office. The confidence that had filled the room moments ago evaporated into the sterile hospital corridor. Marcus led the way, his shoulders still squared with defiance, but there was uncertainty creeping into his posture. Dr. Rebecca Foster closed the door behind them with a controlled click that somehow felt louder than a slam. She stood before them, her arms crossed, her eyes moving from face to face with the precision of a prosecutor examining witnesses. "What," she began, her voice low and measured, "did I just witness in there?" Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but Dr. Foster raised a single finger, silencing him instantly. "That was rhetorical, Dr. Chen. I know exactly what I witnessed. I watched through the observation window for the past 15 minutes. What I saw was a textbook example of arrogance masquerading as clinical assessment." Sarah stepped forward, her voice carefully professional. "Dr. Foster, with respect, we were applying the diagnostic criteria for PTSD and factitious disorders. The patient's presentation has multiple red flags that any competent clinician would—" "Red flags," Dr. Foster repeated, her tone sharp as a scalpel. "Tell me, Dr. Williams, what do you know about studies and observation operations during the Vietnam War? Sarah blinked, caught off guard. I'm not familiar with that specific. MACVSOG, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observation Group. Covert operations run jointly by the CIA and Special Forces. Deep reconnaissance missions into Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam. Missions that were classified at the highest levels. Missions that even today, 50 years later, remain partially sealed because of the diplomatic implications. The color began to drain from Marcus's face, but Dr. Foster wasn't finished. These weren't regular soldiers, doctors. These were men who were officially listed as deserters if they were captured. Men who carried no identification. Men whose families were told they died in training accidents when they vanished into the jungle and never came back. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the group. Men whose service records were deliberately falsified to maintain plausible deniability. Tommy Richardson, the quiet Southern student, spoke up hesitantly. Are you saying Mr. Sullivan was part of these operations? Dr. Foster's expression softened slightly as she looked at Tommy, recognizing genuine curiosity rather than defensive posturing. I'm saying that your entire analysis in there was based on the assumption that absence of documentation equals fabrication. You took a man's lifetime of sacrifice and reduced it to a billing code and a diagnosis of malingering. Elena Vasquez felt her stomach drop. She'd sensed something was wrong, but she'd stayed silent. The guilt of that silence now pressed down on her like a physical weight. Dr. Foster. Marcus tried again, his voice lacking its earlier conviction. The medical literature clearly indicates that we should question inconsistent narratives. We were taught to look for. You were taught critical thinking, Dr. Chen, but critical thinking requires wisdom to accompany knowledge. It requires the humility to understand that your tablet, your databases, your algorithmic diagnostic tools, they don't contain the sum total of human experience. She pulled out her phone, tapped the screen a few times, and turned it toward the students. On the screen was a black and white photograph, grainy with age. 6 men stood in jungle fatigues, their faces young, but their eyes ancient. They held weapons that looked well used, and behind them was the blurred outline of a helicopter. This photograph was taken in 1971. It was classified until 2003. These men had just completed a mission that saved 17 American POWs from a camp in Laos. Officially, this mission never happened. Officially, these POWs escaped on their own. She zoomed in on one face in the photo. Even through the decades and the grain of the old film, the eyes were recognizable. Sea glass green. James Sullivan. That young man in the photo spent 3 years running missions that had a 70% casualty rate. He watched his teammates die in ways that would give you nightmares for the rest of your lives if I described them in detail. He was awarded medals that he's not allowed to display. He attended funerals for men whose families still don't know how they really died. The hallway was completely silent, except for the distant beep of hospital monitors and the soft whoosh of the ventilation system. When Mr. Sullivan tells you his missions were classified, he's not being evasive. When he can't provide documentation, it's not because he's lying. It's because his government made the deliberate choice to erase his service from the official record to protect diplomatic relations with countries we were never supposed to be operating in. Marcus's face had gone from pale to ashen. We didn't know. No, Dr. Foster agreed, her voice gentler now, but no less firm. You didn't know. But that's precisely the point. You didn't know, yet you felt qualified to pass judgment.
You saw an elderly veteran with trauma he couldn't fully articulate, and instead of approaching him with compassion and curiosity, you approached him with suspicion and contempt. Sarah's hands were shaking slightly. She clasped them together. What should we have done differently? Listen, Dr. Foster said simply. Actually listen, not to find inconsistencies to support your preconceived diagnosis, but to understand. You should have recognized that a man who has lived 79 years, who has survived experiences you cannot fathom, might have wisdom that doesn't fit neatly into your differential diagnosis flowcharts. She looked at each student in turn. I heard Dr. Chen mock Mr. Sullivan for refusing SSRIs. Did any of you bother to ask why? Did you consider that a man trained to maintain absolute mental clarity under life-or-death circumstances might have legitimate concerns about medications that alter consciousness? Did you explore alternatives, therapy modalities, support groups, non-pharmaceutical interventions? Elena finally found her voice. No, ma'am. We just assumed non-compliance meant he wasn't serious about treatment. Exactly. You made assumptions. Comfortable assumptions that allowed you to feel superior rather than challenged. It's easier to dismiss a patient as a malingerer than to sit with the uncomfortable truth that their suffering is real and your tools might be inadequate to address it. Down the hallway, a nurse pushed a medication cart past them, pretending not to notice the tense tableau of the chief psychiatrist lecturing the medical students. The wheels of the cart squeaked rhythmically against the linoleum. Here's what's going to happen now, Dr. Foster said, her voice taking on a harder edge. Dr. Chen, you're going to write a formal letter of apology to Mr. Sullivan. Not a pro forma medical apology, a real one. You're going to acknowledge specifically what you said, why it was wrong, and what you've learned from this. Marcus nodded, unable to meet her eyes. Dr. Williams, you're going to research MAC-V-SOG operations and prepare a presentation for the entire psychiatric residency program on the diagnostic challenges of treating veterans with classified service histories. Due next week. Sarah swallowed hard. Yes, Dr. Foster. The rest of you will be writing reflection papers on the intersection of clinical skepticism and compassionate care. I want to see evidence of actual thought, not just regurgitated textbook platitudes. 10 pages minimum, due Monday. The students murmured their acknowledgement, properly chastened. But Dr. Foster wasn't done. More importantly, all of you are going to go back into that room and you're going to apologize to Mr. Sullivan, face to face. And then you're going to ask him, with genuine humility, if he would be willing to help you understand what his experience was really like, not as a case study, as a human being who has survived the unsurvivable. Tommy raised his hand slightly, then lowered it, unsure if the gesture was appropriate. Dr. Foster nodded at him to speak. Will he forgive us? Tommy asked quietly. After what we said? Dr. Foster's expression shifted, something between sadness and hope crossing her features. Men like James Sullivan have spent their entire lives carrying burdens that weren't theirs to carry, protecting people who never knew they needed protection, and absorbing judgment from those who could never understand their sacrifice. Forgiveness? She paused. Forgiveness is probably something he's better at than any of us. She turned toward the conference room door, her hand on the handle. But that doesn't mean you deserve it. That's something you'll have to earn. Marcus Chen felt something unfamiliar settling in his chest. Genuine shame, unmarred by defensiveness or rationalization. He'd spent his entire medical education being the smartest person in the room, the one with the quickest diagnosis, the sharpest insight. But standing in this corridor, about to face a man he'd casually attempted to discredit, he realized that intelligence without wisdom was just sophisticated ignorance. Dr. Foster opened the door. Through the gap they could see James Sullivan, still sitting quietly in his wheelchair, his gnarled hands resting in his lap, his eyes fixed on that same distant point on the wall, waiting with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that some battles couldn't be rushed. "After you, doctors," she gestured into the room. It wasn't an invitation, it was a reckoning. The walk back into Conference Room B felt like the longest 20 feet any of the students had ever traversed. Marcus Chen, who had strode out of the room with clinical confidence just minutes earlier, now moved with the hesitant steps of someone approaching a minefield. James Sullivan hadn't moved. He sat in his wheelchair exactly as they'd left him, positioned near the corner like a piece of forgotten furniture. But now, looking at him with the context Dr. Foster had provided, everything was different. The simple gray cardigan wasn't just an old man's clothing. It was the civilian uniform of someone who had spent years in the shadows. The distant look in his eyes wasn't evasion. It was the burden of carrying memories too heavy to share. Dr. Foster opened the door. Through the gap they could see James Sullivan, still sitting quietly in his wheelchair, his gnarled hands resting in his lap, his eyes fixed on that same distant point on the wall, waiting with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that some battles couldn't be rushed. "After you, doctors," she gestured into the room. It wasn't an invitation, it was a reckoning. The walk back into Conference Room B felt like the longest 20 feet any of the students had ever traversed. Marcus Chen, who had strode out of the room with clinical confidence just minutes earlier, now moved with the hesitant steps of someone approaching a minefield. James Sullivan hadn't moved. He sat in his wheelchair exactly as they'd left him, positioned near the corner like a piece of forgotten furniture. But now, looking at him with the context Dr. Foster had provided, everything was different. The simple gray cardigan wasn't just an old man's clothing. It was the civilian uniform of someone who had spent years in the shadows. The distant look in his eyes wasn't evasion. It was the burden of carrying memories too heavy to share. Dr. Foster entered last, closing the door with a soft click. She didn't take a seat at the table. Instead, she stood near James's wheelchair, a silent sentinel, ensuring that whatever happened next would happen with the respect this man had earned. The students arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, no longer sitting in positions of clinical authority, but standing as supplicants. The power dynamic had completely inverted. Marcus Chen cleared his throat. His mouth was dry, and for someone who had never struggled to find words, the silence stretched out painfully. He'd written hundreds of patient notes, delivered dozens of case presentations, but crafting a genuine apology to a man he'd publicly humiliated was entirely different territory. "Mr. Sullivan," Marcus began, his voice lacking all its earlier bravado, I need to apologize to you, sir." James slowly turned his head, those sea-glass eyes focusing on Marcus with an intensity that made the young medical student want to look away. But he didn't. He held the gaze, knowing he owed the old veteran at least that much. "What I said in here today was inexcusable," Marcus continued, the words coming with increasing difficulty. "I accused you of lying about your service. I mocked your trauma. I treated your suffering as if it were a billing fraud scheme." His voice cracked slightly. "I had no right. I had no knowledge of what you actually experienced, and instead of approaching you with an open mind, I approached you with arrogance and contempt." James didn't respond immediately. He simply studied Marcus's face the way someone might examine a complicated piece of machinery, looking for the genuine parts beneath the surface mechanisms. "I called your memories convenient fabrications. I dismissed your inability to provide documentation as evasion. I implied you were after disability benefits you hadn't earned. And I did all of this in front of my peers, treating you like a teaching example rather than a human being who has sacrificed more for this country than I can possibly comprehend." The room remained silent. Even the usual ambient sounds of the hospital seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath.
Sarah Williams stepped forward, her professional composure completely stripped away. Her eyes were red-rimmed, though she was fighting to maintain control. "Mr. Sullivan, I reinforced everything Dr. Chen said. I questioned your credibility. I suggested you were non-compliant with treatment because I couldn't conceive that your refusal might come from informed choice rather than obstinance." Her voice grew steadier as she continued. "I treated you the way I'd treat someone trying to scam the system, and I did it without a single moment of self-reflection about whether my assumptions might be wrong. I'm deeply sorry, sir. You deserved better. You deserved so much better." One by one, the other students offered their apologies. Tommy Richardson, his southern accent thicker with emotion, apologized for his silence when he'd felt something was wrong. Elena Vasquez, tears now openly streaming down her face, apologized for not trusting her instincts that had screamed this man's pain was real. Through it all, James Sullivan sat quietly, absorbing each apology with the same patient stillness he'd shown earlier. When the last student had spoken, the room fell into a heavy silence. Dr. Foster placed a gentle hand on James's shoulder. "Mr. Sullivan, you have no obligation to accept these apologies. You have no obligation to help these students understand anything. What happened here today should never have happened, and you would be entirely justified in refusing to engage further." James was quiet for a long moment. His gnarled fingers drummed once, twice against the armrest of his wheelchair, an unconscious rhythm that might have been a long-ago signal to teammates in the jungle. Then he spoke, his gravelly voice filling the room. "When I was 23 years old," James began, his eyes focusing on something beyond the walls of the conference room, "I believed I knew everything too. I'd completed training that broke men twice my size. I could navigate by stars, survive on insects and rainwater, kill silently from 300 yards. I thought knowledge and skill were the same as wisdom." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, recognizing himself in the description. "My first real mission, we inserted into Cambodia. It was supposed to be reconnaissance only. Observe and report on North Vietnamese supply routes. Simple." A bitter smile touched his lips. Nothing was ever simple. The students were completely still now, barely breathing, granted an audience with history that textbooks could never capture. "We'd been in country for 3 days when we found a village that wasn't on any map. It had been hit hard, probably by accident, a bombing run that strayed off course. There were survivors, injured, dying." James's hands tightened on the armrests. "Our orders were clear. No contact with civilians, no deviations from mission parameters. We were ghosts. We didn't exist." Elena felt her heart breaking, understanding where this was going. "I wanted to help them," James said quietly, "but I knew the rules. I knew the mission. I knew that revealing ourselves could compromise operations that were bigger than any single village." He paused, the weight of decades pressing down on him. "Our team leader, a man named Frank Morrison, he looked at those wounded villagers, and then he looked at me and said, 'Some rules are meant to be broken, Sullivan. Our humanity isn't classified.'" A single tear traced down James's weathered cheek, cutting a path through the landscape of age and memory. "We spent 8 hours treating those villagers with our medical supplies.
We compromised our position. We risked our lives and our mission. And when we finally extracted, Morrison took full responsibility. He was court-martialed in a classified proceeding, stripped of his rank and discharged dishonorably. At least that's what the official record says. James looked directly at Marcus now. 3 months later, Frank Morrison died in a car accident stateside. Except there was no accident. He ate his service pistol in a motel room in Georgia because the guilt of choosing between his orders and his conscience destroyed him. The Army buried him quietly, and most of his family still doesn't know the truth. The room felt suffocating with the weight of the revelation. I learned something that day in that village, and in every day since Frank died. Knowledge without wisdom is dangerous. Skill without compassion is cruelty. And certainty without humility is the fastest path to becoming the kind of person who destroys others while believing they're doing the right thing. He shifted in his wheelchair, his old bones protesting the movement. You students, you have more medical knowledge in your tablets than I could learn in 10 lifetimes. You can diagnose conditions I've never heard of. You can cite studies and statistics and treatment protocols. His sea-glass eyes moved from face to face. But until you learn that every patient sitting across from you is carrying their own Cambodia, their own Frank Morrison, their own classified grief, you're just technicians operating on machines, not doctors treating human beings. Marcus felt something break open inside his chest. Not just shame, but a fundamental reordering of how he understood his calling. This wasn't about being the smartest person in the room. It was about being wise enough to know when your intelligence was blinding you to deeper truths. I accept your apologies, James said finally. Not because you've earned forgiveness, but because I've spent too many years carrying anger and grief to add yours to the load. We all make mistakes. The question is whether we learn from them or let them define us. Sarah wiped her eyes, no longer trying to hide her tears. How do we learn, Mr. Sullivan? How do we become the kind of doctors who see the whole person? James considered this carefully. You start by understanding that the most important question you can ask a patient isn't what are your symptoms, it's what's your story. And then you actually listen to the answer, even when, especially when, it doesn't fit your diagnostic flowcharts.
Dr. Foster stepped forward, her own eyes glistening. Mr. Sullivan, would you be willing to share more of your story with these students? Not as a case study, but as a teacher. Would you help them understand what it means to carry invisible wounds? James looked at the 7 young faces before him, faces that now showed genuine openness, humility, and a hunger to understand. He thought of Frank Morrison, of all his teammates who never made it home, of the decades of silence and classified grief. I'll share what I can, he said quietly. Some things are still sealed. Some things I still can't talk about. Not because of classification, but because the words don't exist for what we experienced. But what I can tell you, I will. Tommy Richardson stepped closer, his voice respectful. Where do we start, sir? James looked toward the window, where the afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows across the hospital grounds. We start with what you need to understand about the kind of war that never officially happened, and the kind of men who fought it in the shadows. Dr. Foster quietly gestured for the students to take seats around the conference table. The atmosphere had transformed completely. What had been an arena of judgment was now a sacred space of learning. Marcus Chen carefully moved a chair closer to James Sullivan's wheelchair, no longer the arrogant lecturer, but a humble student. James's gnarled fingers traced the edge of his wheelchair's armrest, an unconscious gesture that seemed to ground him in the present even as his mind prepared to journey into the past. The afternoon light streaming through the window cast golden bars across the polished table, and in that light, The old veteran seemed both present and distant, existing in multiple timelines simultaneously. "The war you read about in history books," James began, his gravelly voice measured and deliberate, "isn't the war I fought. Your textbooks talk about the Tet Offensive, about Khe Sanh, about My Lai. Those were real. Those were important. But there was another war happening in the margins, in the blank spaces of the map, in countries where we officially had no presence." Elena Vasquez leaned forward slightly, her earlier guilt now channeled into intense focus. She pulled out a notebook, then hesitated, looking at James. "Is it okay if I take notes, sir?" James nodded slowly. "Take your notes. Just remember that some truths can't be captured in bullet points." He settled back slightly in his wheelchair, his eyes taking on that distant quality the students had misinterpreted as evasion. Now they understood it was the look of someone accessing memories filed away in the deepest, most protected vaults of the mind. "The war you read about in history books," James began, his gravelly voice measured and deliberate, "isn't the war I fought. Your textbooks talk about the Tet Offensive, about Khe Sanh, about My Lai. Those were real. Those were important. But there was another war happening in the margins, in the blank spaces of the map, in countries where we officially had no presence." Elena Vasquez leaned forward slightly, her earlier guilt now channeled into intense focus. She pulled out a notebook, then hesitated, looking at James. "Is it okay if I take notes, sir?" James nodded slowly. "Take your notes. Just remember that some truths can't be captured in bullet points." He settled back slightly in his wheelchair, his eyes taking on that distant quality the students had misinterpreted as evasion. Now they understood it was the look of someone accessing memories filed away in the deepest, most protected vaults of the mind. "In 1970, I was recruited out of the 5th Special Forces Group. You didn't volunteer for SOG, you didn't volunteer for something that didn't officially exist. You were tapped. One day you're running regular reconnaissance missions in the Central Highlands, and the next day, a man in civilian clothes shows up in your CO's office and your entire service record gets rewritten." Tommy Richardson's pen hovered over his notebook. "Rewritten how?" "I was officially transferred to a training unit in Fort Bragg. My family received letters postmarked from North Carolina, but I never set foot in North Carolina. I was in Kontum, running missions across the fence, that's what we called the Cambodian and Laotian borders. Official military records say I spent 1970 to 1973 as a training instructor. The truth is, I spent those years doing things that would have caused international incidents if they came to light." Sarah Williams, who had questioned the absence of documentation earlier, now understood the terrible irony. The very thing she'd used as evidence of fabrication was actually proof of authenticity. The government had deliberately erased the evidence to protect itself. "What kind of missions?" Marcus asked quietly, then quickly added, what can you tell us about them?" James was silent for a moment, his jaw working slightly, as if chewing on which memories were safe to share, and which ones remained locked behind classification walls that exist as much in his conscience as in government files. Prisoner rescues, intelligence gathering, target elimination. We called them over-the-fence operations because we were crossing into neutral countries to hit enemy sanctuaries. His voice grew quieter. The North Vietnamese knew they were untouchable in Cambodia and Laos. Geneva Accords protected them. So they built supply depots, training camps, hospital complexes, all on the other side of borders we weren't supposed to cross. "But you crossed them," Elena said softly. "We crossed them. 6-man teams, sometimes less. Inserted by helicopter at night, usually several kilometers from our actual target to avoid detection. We'd hump through triple canopy jungle in complete darkness, carrying equipment that would get us executed as spies if we were captured." Dr. Foster, who had heard portions of this story before in clinical sessions, watched the students' faces carefully. They were beginning to understand that PTSD wasn't just a diagnostic code. It was the soul's response to experiences that shattered normal human comprehension. The jungle wasn't like anything you can imagine, James continued, and for the first time there was a tremor in his voice. It was alive in a way that wanted to kill you. Snakes that could drop from trees and stop your heart. Insects that burrowed under your skin. Malaria, dysentery, infections that turned a small cut into a death sentence. And that was before you even encountered the enemy. He paused, his breathing slightly heavier now. The students noticed his hands had begun to shake minutely, and they understood this wasn't malingering. This was the physical manifestation of a nervous system that had been hardwired for survival in an environment of constant mortal threat.
"We moved at night mostly," James said. "You couldn't use flashlights, couldn't make noise. The North Vietnamese had some of the best trackers in the world, former hunters from the mountain tribes. They could follow a broken twig, a disturbed leaf. One careless step could bring a company of NVA regulars down on your position." "How did you navigate?" Tommy asked, his southern accent softened with awe. "Stars when we could see them through the canopy. Compass, dead reckoning. Sometimes we'd navigate by smell. You could tell you were near a base camp by the scent of cooking fires, of fish sauce, of diesel fuel." James's eyes were fully distant now, seeing a jungle that existed half a century ago and half a world away. "Rodriguez, one of my teammates, he could smell an ambush. I know that sounds impossible, but I swear he had a sixth sense. He'd freeze, sniff the air like a hunting dog, and sure enough, there'd be NVA waiting 100 meters ahead." "What happened to Rodriguez?" Elena asked, then immediately regretted the question when she saw James's face tighten. James was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "That's part of the story I need to tell you. Because you asked earlier about my PTSD symptoms, about why I refuse certain medications, about why I can't sleep more than 3 hours at a time." Dr. Foster leaned forward slightly, concerned. "James, you don't have to—" "They need to understand," James interrupted gently. "They need to understand what invisible wounds look like and where they come from." He took a slow breath, steadying himself. "March 1972. We got intelligence about a high-valued target, a North Vietnamese general coordinating supply routes through the southern Laotian panhandle. Command wanted him captured or eliminated. 6 of us inserted 20 clicks inside Laos." The students were completely still, aware they were being granted access to a story that had been classified, buried, and locked away for over 50 years. "The insertion went wrong from the start," James said. "Our helicopter took ground fire on approach. The pilot had to drop us 3 kilometers from our planned LZ, in an area we hadn't scouted. We were compromised before we even hit the ground." His hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair more tightly. "We moved fast, trying to reach our objective before the NVA could organize a response. But Rodriguez, he stopped about 2 clicks in, said something felt wrong, said we were being herded." "Herded?" Marcus echoed. "Pushed toward a kill zone," James explained. "The NVA were good at it. They'd let you think you were hunting them when all along they were positioning you exactly where they wanted you. Rodriguez wanted to abort, extract immediately, but our team leader, Captain William Driscoll, he overruled him, said we were too close to the objective to quit." James's breathing had become more labored. Dr. Foster moved closer, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, ready to stop this if it became too much. But James shook his head slightly, determined to continue. "We reached the target compound at dusk. It was too easy. A general's headquarters with minimal security. Rodriguez was nearly panicking by then, begging Driscoll to call it off." James's voice cracked. "I should have backed him up. I saw the same signs. But I was young, and Driscoll was my commanding officer, and I'd been trained to follow orders." The conference room felt smaller somehow, the walls closing in with the weight of impending tragedy. We moved in at full dark, got within 50 meters of the main structure when Rodriguez stopped dead. He turned to me, and I'll never forget what he said. "It's not a headquarters, Sullivan. It's a trap." James closed his eyes, and a tear escaped, tracing down the canyon of wrinkles on his weathered face. The jungle exploded. Automatic weapons fire from 3 sides, RPGs. They'd been waiting for us. The general was bait, and we'd taken it. His whole body was trembling now, lost in the memory. Rodriguez took the first rounds. He was right next to me when they hit him. I felt his blood splash across my face. He went down, and I grabbed him, tried to drag him to cover, but there was no cover. There was just killing ground, and we were in the center of it. The students sat frozen, witnessing not just a story, but a wound being reopened in real time. Driscoll was screaming into the radio, calling for extraction, but the fire was too heavy. The helicopter couldn't land. We were pinned down, 3 men dead already, ammunition running out, and Rodriguez was dying in my arms. James's voice broke completely. He looked at me with these wide, terrified eyes, and he said, "Don't let them take me alive. Promise me, Sullivan, don't let them take me alive." Dr. Foster's own eyes were wet now. She'd heard fragments of this story before, but never like this, never with this raw honesty. I promised him, and when the NVA started closing in, when I knew we had maybe minutes before they overran our position, I kept that promise. The implications hung in the air like a physical presence. The students understood, truly understood for the first time, that trauma wasn't an abstract clinical concept. It was Rodriguez's blood on James's face. It was a promise made in hell and kept in the darkness. It was carrying the weight of impossible choices for 50 years.
"That's why I can't take your medications," James said, looking directly at Sarah Williams. "Because the few times I tried, the nightmares became so vivid, I couldn't tell what was memory and what was hallucination. I'd wake up with my hands around my wife's throat, because in the dream, she was an NVA soldier. I'd rather live with less sleep than risk hurting someone I love." Understanding crashed over Sarah like a wave. His refusal wasn't non-compliance. It was informed choice, born from terrible experience. "That's why I can't give you documentation," James continued, meeting Marcus's eyes. "Because Rodriguez officially died in a training accident at Fort Benning. His family got a folded flag and a story about a parachute malfunction. They never knew he died a hero in Laos. They never knew I held him when he died. The mission never happened. The trap never existed. And I've carried the truth alone for 53 years. The room was utterly silent except for the quiet sound of Elena's tears hitting her notebook. The conference room had become a confessional, and James Sullivan's words hung in the air like incense, heavy, sacred, and transformative. The students sat in stunned silence, each grappling with the realization that they had come within moments of dismissing a man who carried more pain in his pinky finger than they'd witnessed in their entire medical careers combined. Dr. Foster gently squeezed James's shoulder, a silent question, "Can you continue?" James gave a barely perceptible nod, though his hands still trembled against the armrests of his wheelchair. "We held that position for 47 minutes, James continued, his voice steadier now, as though the act of sharing had released some pressure valve deep within. "Felt like 47 hours. 2 of us left standing, me and a kid from Texas named Danny Kowalski. We were down to our last magazines when the extraction bird finally punched through." He paused, his eyes tracking something invisible across the conference room wall. Perhaps the memory of tracer rounds cutting through jungle darkness. Perhaps the rotor wash of a Huey descending into hell. The pilot, a warrant officer named Curtis Hayes, he dropped that bird into an LZ that was hotter than Hades itself. He was taking fire from every direction, and he didn't flinch, just held steady while Danny and I loaded our dead. His voice caught. Rodriguez was the last one I carried. I wouldn't let anyone else touch him. That was my promise to keep, my burden to carry. Marcus Chen found himself leaning forward, his earlier clinical detachment completely shattered. This wasn't a case study. This was a masterclass in what it meant to be human under inhuman circumstances. The flight back was maybe 20 minutes, but somewhere in those 20 minutes, something inside me broke. Not like a bone breaking, clean, fixable, more like a foundation cracking. You can't see it from the outside, but the whole structure is compromised. "That's when the PTSD began?" Elena asked softly. James shook his head slowly. "That's when I first noticed it couldn't be contained anymore. But it had been building for years. Every mission, every close call, every brother lost. PTSD isn't a light switch that flips on during one traumatic event. It's more like a dam filling up, one terrible experience at a time, until one day something makes it overflow and you realize it's been breaking you all along." Dr. Foster moved to lean against the conference table, her arms crossed, not in judgment, but in contemplation. She'd been treating veterans for nearly 30 decades, but hearing James articulate his experience with such clarity was illuminating even for her. "When we landed at the forward operating base, they took Rodriguez's body to the morgue. They took our weapons to be cleaned. They took our after-action reports." His jaw tightened. "Then a full-bird colonel I'd never seen before took me to a room and spent 3 hours explaining what had actually happened that night." "What do you mean, what actually happened?" Tommy asked, confused. "According to the official record, there was no mission. Rodriguez didn't die in Laos. He died stateside in a training accident. The rest of us never were there. The NVA general we'd been hunting never existed. The fighter fight never happened. They even had falsified logs showing our helicopter never left the base that night." Sarah's hands pressed flat against the table. "They erased it. All of it." "Every single trace," James confirmed. "The colonel told me that if I ever spoke about what really happened, I'd be court-martialed for revealing classified operations. Rodriguez's family would lose his death benefits. The other families would have their sons' memories dishonored, and I'd spend the rest of my life in Leavenworth for treason." The magnitude of the betrayal was staggering. These men had given everything for their country, and in return, their country had erased them from history. "So, I stayed silent," James said quietly. "I went to Rodriguez's funeral and watched his mother cry over a closed casket, while a chaplain talked about a training accident that never happened. I shook her hand and told her how brave her son was, and she thanked me for being his friend at Fort Benning, a place he'd never set foot in." A tear traced down James's weathered cheek. "You want to know what PTSD feels like? It feels like carrying Rodriguez's real death in your chest while the whole world believes a lie. It feels like waking up at 3 a.m, drenched in sweat, hearing him beg you not to let them take him alive. It feels like knowing you did the right thing and the worst thing simultaneously, and having no one you can talk to about it because your truth is classified."
Dr. Foster's voice was gentle but clinical, helping to bridge James's experience to the student's medical understanding. This is what we call moral injury, distinct from PTSD but often intertwined with it. It's the psychological damage that occurs when someone is forced to participate in or witness events that violate their core moral beliefs, often in the service of a greater good they're told they must protect. "I killed my best friend to keep a promise," James said bluntly, looking directly at the students. "I did it because he begged me to, because the alternative was worse, because in that moment it was the only mercy I could offer, and then I had to pretend it never happened. Tell me, doctors, what's your protocol for that? What's the medication that makes peace with that?" The question hung unanswered, because there was no answer. at least not one that fit in their medical texts. I finished my tour, James continued, his voice taking on a mechanical quality again. Ran 17 more missions, watched 3 more teammates die. Officially, I was still a training instructor in North Carolina. In reality, I was becoming a ghost in every sense of the word. Ghost missions in countries we weren't in, becoming a ghost of the person I used to be. He shifted in his wheelchair, wincing slightly from old injuries that probably had their own classified stories. When my enlistment was up in '73, they gave me an honorable discharge with a service record that was 90% fiction. They gave me a handshake and a warning, never speak about what really happened. They gave me a government job offer. Keep working in the shadows, keep carrying secrets. I turned them down. What did you do instead? Elena asked. I tried to build a normal life, James said with a sad smile. Met a woman named Catherine at a VA hospital. She was a nurse. I was there for malaria treatment, officially. Really, I was having nightmares so bad I hadn't slept more than 2 hours a night in months. She saw through my lies faster than anyone ever had. His expression softened at the memory. Catherine became my anchor. Married her in 1974, had 2 daughters, got a job as a mechanic. Turned out that skills you learn keeping helicopters running in combat zones translate well to civilian aircraft maintenance. Built what looked from the outside like a perfectly normal American life. But the weight was still there, Dr. Foster said gently. The weight was always there, James confirmed. Catherine knew something was wrong. She'd wake up to find me sitting in the garage at 4 in the morning, just staring at nothing. She'd see me flinch at fireworks, see me scan every room for exits, see me wake up in cold sweats, calling out names she'd never heard. But I couldn't tell her why. Classified, national security. The secrets that were eating me alive were the same secrets I was honor-bound to keep. Marcus felt a profound shift in his understanding. He had spent years learning to identify PTSD symptoms, but he had never truly comprehended the impossible situation of someone trying to heal from wounds they couldn't acknowledge, from events they couldn't speak about, from grief that officially didn't exist. In 1987, Catherine sat me down, James said, his voice thick with emotion. Our daughters were 12 and 14. Good kids, honor students. But they were starting to notice their dad was different, that he didn't go to loud school events, that he couldn't watch war movies, that he had a 1,000-yard stare when he thought no one was looking. He paused, gathering himself. Catherine told me she loved me, but she needed to understand what was breaking me. She needed to know what she was fighting alongside me. And I had to make a choice. Keep my oath to the government that erased Rodriguez and all the others, or break it for the woman who was trying to save my life. The students leaned forward unconsciously, invested completely in this man's story. I told her everything, James said. Spent an entire weekend breaking every classification protocol I'd sworn to uphold. Told her about Rodriguez, about the missions that never happened, about the promises I'd kept and the ones that kept me up at night. When I finished, I was certain she'd leave. Certain she'd realize she'd married a killer, a man who'd violated every rule to unburden himself. His eyes glistened. Instead, she held me, just held me while I cried for the first time since 1972. She said, James, you've been carrying this alone for 15 years. You're not alone anymore. I'm carrying it with you now. Dr. Foster wiped her own eyes discreetly. This was the healing that medicine alone could never provide. The healing of shared burden, of witnessed pain, of love that chose to shoulder darkness together. Catherine saved my life, James said simply. Not by fixing me, I'll never be fixed, but by seeing me, by knowing the truth and loving me anyway, by understanding that some wounds don't heal, they just become part of who you are. He looked at each student in turn. That's what I needed you to understand. When I sit in your exam room and can't explain why certain medications trigger me, why certain questions make me shut down, why my documentation has gaps and inconsistencies, I'm not being difficult.
I'm not malingering. I'm a man trying to navigate a medical system that wants simple answers to questions that have no simple answers." "How do we help patients like you, then?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "If the conventional tools don't work, if the documentation doesn't exist, if the trauma is classified, how do we provide care?"
James leaned forward slightly, fixing them with those sea-glass eyes that had seen too much and somehow still held compassion. "You start by believing us. You start by understanding that absence of proof isn't proof of absence. You start by recognizing that some battles leave scars that don't show up on any scan or diagnostic test." The afternoon sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the conference room. Time had become elastic in this space, simultaneously standing still and racing forward. "You'll have patients who can't tell you everything," James continued. "Maybe because it's classified. Maybe because the words don't exist for what they experienced. Maybe because speaking it aloud makes it real in a way they can't survive. Your job isn't to force those words out of them. Your job is to create a space safe enough that when they're ready, they know you'll listen without judgment." Tommy Richardson spoke up, his voice thoughtful. "Mr. Sullivan, you mentioned Catherine helped you carry this burden. Is she—" James's expression clouded. "She passed away 2 years ago. Cancer. Fought it for 18 months with the same strength she showed fighting for me all those years." His voice cracked. "Losing her was like losing my tether to the present. Without her, those old ghosts got louder again." And suddenly, the students understood why James was here, in this hospital, in this psychiatric ward. He wasn't a malingerer seeking benefits. He was a widower who had lost the one person who knew his truth, who had helped him carry his classified grief, who had been his reason to keep fighting the ghosts that never stopped whispering in the darkness. The revelation of Catherine's death settled over the conference room like a heavy blanket. The students now understood with devastating clarity that James Sullivan wasn't just battling ghosts from 1972. He was battling the fresh, raw grief of losing his lifeline, his interpreter, the one person who had known all of him and loved him anyway. Dr. Foster moved closer to James's wheelchair, her clinical mask completely dissolved. "James, you never told me Catherine had passed. In our sessions you mentioned she wasn't well, but—" "Couldn't say the words," James said quietly, his gnarled hands gripping the armrests. "If I didn't say it out loud, maybe it wasn't real. Maybe I'd go home and she'd still be in the kitchen, radio playing, telling me about her day." He looked up at Dr. Foster with eyes that held 50 years of accumulated sorrow. "Turns out that's not how grief works." Elena Vasquez, who had been furiously taking notes throughout James's testimony, set down her pen. The instinct to document was overwhelmed by the need to simply be present. "Mr. Sullivan, when you lost Catherine, did the PTSD symptoms get worse?" James nodded slowly. "Catherine was my early warning system. She could see when I was spiraling before I could. She'd know when to pull me back, when to give me space, when to just sit with me in silence. Without her—" He trailed off, his jaw working. "It's like losing your co-pilot mid-flight. You're still flying, but everything's harder, and you're not sure you remember how to land anymore." Marcus Chen, who had begun this day as a confident diagnostician and was ending it as a humbled student, leaned forward. "Is that why you came to the hospital, sir? Because you felt yourself losing control?" "I came because my daughter found me in the garage at 4 in the morning, sitting in my truck with the engine running," James said bluntly. The students' faces paled. "I wasn't trying to end it. At least, I don't think I was. I was just tired. Tired of carrying it all. Tired of fighting ghosts. Tired of waking up, reaching for Catherine, and finding empty space." Dr. Foster's expression was pained but understanding. "James, you never told me Catherine had passed.
In our sessions, you mentioned she wasn't well, but couldn't say the words, James said quietly, his gnarled hands gripping the armrests. If I didn't say it out loud, maybe it wasn't real. Maybe I'd go home and she'd still be in the kitchen, radio playing, telling me about her day. He looked up at Dr. Foster with eyes that held 50 years of accumulated sorrow. Turns out that's not how grief works. Sarah Williams, who had begun this day as a confident diagnostician and was ending it as a humbled student, leaned forward. "Is that why you came to the hospital, sir? Because you felt yourself losing control?" "I came because my daughter found me in the garage at 4 in the morning, sitting in my truck with the engine running," James said bluntly. The students' faces paled. "I wasn't trying to end it. At least, I don't think I was. I was just tired. Tired of carrying it all. Tired of fighting ghosts. Tired of waking up, reaching for Catherine, and finding empty space." Dr. Foster's expression was pained but understanding. "Your daughter called 911 and they brought you here for a psychiatric evaluation." "She saved my life," he confirmed, "just like her mother did 40 years ago. History repeating itself, I suppose. And that's when I met all of you, ready to prove I was faking it for a benefits check." The shame that crossed the students' faces was profound and appropriate. "Mr. Sullivan, I need you to know that I will spend the rest of my career making sure I never make this mistake again. I will approach every patient, every story, every seemingly impossible narrative with the humility you've taught me today." "That's good," James said gently. "But humility alone isn't enough. You need to build systems that recognize what you can't see." Dr. Foster straightened slightly, her clinical mind engaging with the educational opportunity. "James is right. The medical establishment has failed veterans like him systematically. We've built diagnostic criteria that assume documentation exists, that assume trauma can be neatly categorized, that assume patients can articulate their suffering in ways that map to our billing codes." She turned to address the students directly. "What you witnessed today wasn't just one old man's story. It's representative of thousands of veterans whose service exists in the shadows, whose wounds were classified along with their missions, whose healing has been complicated by institutional betrayal and enforced silence." Tommy Richardson raised his hand hesitantly, then lowered it, realizing this wasn't that kind of classroom. "Dr. Foster, how do we change that? How do we build better systems?" "You start by changing how you listen," James interjected, before Dr. Foster could respond. "When a patient tells you something that doesn't make sense, that doesn't fit your flow charts, instead of assuming they're lying, ask yourself, what would make this true? What am I not seeing? What don't I know?" He shifted in his wheelchair, wincing from old wounds that would never fully heal. "In the jungle, we had a saying, trust your gut, verify with your eyes, but never dismiss what you can't see. There were threats we couldn't see, punji stakes hidden under leaves, snipers in the canopy, enemy soldiers camouflaged so well they were invisible until they moved. But just because we couldn't see them didn't mean they weren't real." PTSD is the same, Dr. Foster added. The wounds are invisible, but they're devastatingly real, and for veterans with classified service, the usual verification methods don't apply. You can't FOIA request mission records that officially don't exist. You can't get witness statements from teammates who were listed as having died elsewhere. You can't provide documentary evidence of events that were deliberately erased. Marcus stood up, unable to remain seated with the energy of realization coursing through him. "So we have to develop new assessment tools, new frameworks that account for the absence of traditional evidence." "Exactly," Dr. Foster confirmed. "And that starts with clinical interviews that prioritize the patient's lived experience over bureaucratic documentation. It means understanding that consistency isn't the only marker of truth. Sometimes the inconsistencies are where the truth hides." James looked at Marcus with something approaching approval. "You're learning,"
That's good. The arrogance I saw earlier, that would have made you a dangerous doctor. But this humility, this willingness to rebuild your understanding from the ground up, that might make you a healer. The afternoon had given way to early evening. Through the conference room windows, the sky was beginning to shift toward twilight, that liminal space between day and night where the world transforms. It seemed appropriate for the transformation happening in this room. Elena spoke up, her voice thoughtful. "Mr. Sullivan, you mentioned that Catherine helped you carry this burden. Now that she's gone, how do you manage? What keeps you grounded?" James was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "Honestly, some days I don't manage well. Some days the weight is too much, and I understand why Rodriguez begged me for that final mercy, why Frank Morrison chose a motel room in Georgia, why so many of my brothers chose silence, permanent silence, over continuing to carry the load." The darkness in his words was palpable, and the students felt the edges of an abyss they'd never truly understood before. But then I think about what Catherine would say. She'd tell me that surviving isn't enough, that I owe it to Rodriguez, to Frank, to all the others who didn't make it. I owe it to them to find meaning in the survival, to use these broken pieces to build something that matters. "Is that why you agreed to come today?" Dr. Foster asked gently. "Why you agreed to let General Thompson send you to speak with these students?" James nodded slowly. "When Dr. Foster told me there were medical students who needed to understand what invisible wounds look like, I saw an opportunity. Not for me, I'm past saving, I think, but for the next veteran who walks into an exam room carrying classified grief, for the next Rodriguez who needs someone to believe his pain without needing to see his proof." "You're not past saving," Elena said urgently, surprising herself with the force of her conviction. "Sir, with respect, you've just given us the most important lesson of our medical education. Someone with nothing left to give doesn't do that." A flicker of something, hope perhaps, or at least the memory of hope, crossed James's weathered features. "Maybe you're right. Catherine always said I underestimated my own resilience. Said anyone who could survive what I survived and still choose kindness over bitterness was stronger than they knew." Dr. Foster stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her. "James, I'd like to propose something. With your permission, I'd like to establish a veteran consultation program here at the hospital. You'd work with our residents and students, helping them understand what clinical guidelines can't teach, not as a patient, but as an educator, as an expert in survival." James looked up at her, surprise evident in his expression. "You want me to teach?" "I want you to share what you've learned," Dr. Foster clarified. "The medical knowledge they can get from textbooks, but the wisdom, understanding the human heart that carries impossible burdens, recognizing strength that looks like weakness, seeing truth in stories that defy documentation, that only comes from someone who's lived it." The students were nodding enthusiastically now. Marcus stepped forward. "Mr. Sullivan, I know I have no right to ask anything of you after how I treated you today, but if you agreed to this, if you helped teach us, it would be an honor to learn from you, sir." Sarah joined him. "We need this. Future patients need this. We need to learn how to see what we've been trained to overlook." James sat in silence, processing the unexpected turn. He'd come to this hospital broken, seeking help for wounds that had festered for 50 years. He'd expected judgment, skepticism, maybe some medication adjustments and a follow-up appointment. Instead, he'd found students who, after a painful beginning, had proven capable of growth, of humility, of transformation. "Catherine would love this," James said finally, a genuine smile touching his lips for the first time since entering the conference room. "She always said my stubbornness was wasted on just surviving, said I should be helping others navigate their own darkness." He looked up at Dr. Foster. "I'll do it, not because I'm healed, I'm not sure I ever will be, but because Rodriguez and Frank and all the others deserve to have their sacrifices mean something beyond classified folders and forgotten graves." Dr. Foster's face broke into a warm smile. "Thank you, James. This will change lives. I'm certain of it." Tommy Richardson, who had been mostly quiet since his initial apology, spoke up. "Mr. Sullivan, can I ask, what would you want us to remember most from today? If there's one thing you could ensure we carry forward into our practice, what would it be?" James considered this carefully, his sea-glass eyes moving from face to face, seeing not the arrogant students from hours ago, but the humble healers they were becoming. "Remember that every patient is carrying something," James said finally. "Maybe it's classified grief like mine. Maybe it's trauma from abuse they can't speak about. Maybe it's shame or guilt or wounds that have no name. Your job isn't to force them to prove their pain. Your job is to witness it, to honor it, and to help them carry it when they're too tired to carry it alone." He paused, then added, "And remember that healing isn't always about fixing. Sometimes it's about making peace with what's broken. Sometimes it's about finding meaning in the scars. Catherine taught me that. She couldn't take away my nightmares, couldn't erase my memories, couldn't undo what happened in that Laotian jungle, but she could sit with me in the darkness and remind me I wasn't alone. Sometimes that's the most powerful medicine there is." The conference room was quiet, save for the soft sound of Elena crying again. But these were different tears. These were tears of understanding, of purpose, of commitment to becoming the kind of doctor who could hold space for pain that defied diagnosis. Dr. Foster checked her watch, surprised to find that nearly 4 hours had passed since this confrontation had begun. "I think we should wrap up for today. James, you must be exhausted, and these students have a great deal to process and reflect upon." As the students began to gather their belongings, each one approached James individually, no longer as clinicians assessing a patient, but as students expressing gratitude to a teacher. Marcus was last. He knelt beside James's wheelchair, putting himself at eye level with the old veteran. "Sir, I want you to know that I will never forget this day. I will never forget what my arrogance almost cost, not just in terms of your dignity, but in terms of the lesson I almost refused to learn. Thank you for your service, not just to our country, but to us. Today, you didn't owe us grace, but you gave it anyway." James extended his gnarled hand, and Marcus took it, feeling the strength that remained in that weathered grip. "Just promise me you'll pay it forward, son. The next patient who seems difficult, who doesn't fit your boxes, who challenges your assumptions, remember today. Remember that what looks like resistance might be survival. What looks like deception might be protection. What looks like weakness might be the strongest thing you ever witness. I promise, sir. I absolutely promise." As the students filed out of the conference room, Dr. Foster remained behind with James. She pulled a chair close to his wheelchair and sat down, no longer the chief of Psychiatrist, but simply a fellow traveler on the path of healing. "That was brave, James. Sharing Rodriguez, sharing Catherine, sharing all of it. I know that wasn't easy." James looked toward the window, where the evening sky was painted in shades of amber and rose. "Catherine used to say that the bravest thing you can do is let someone see you, really see you, broken pieces and all. Maybe she was right. Maybe I've spent 50 years being brave in all the wrong ways, brave in combat, brave in silence, brave in carrying everything alone. Maybe it's time to be brave enough to be seen." Dr. Foster smiled, her eyes glistening. "I think Catherine would be very proud of you today. I know I am." They sat together in companionable silence as the days surrendered to night. Two people who understood that some wounds never fully heal, but could, with courage and connection, become bearable. Outside the conference room, 7 medical students walked a hospital corridors with transformed hearts, carrying the lesson that would define their careers, that the most important diagnostic tool they possessed wasn't in their white coat pocket or on their computer screen. It was their capacity for compassion, their willingness to believe, and their courage to witness pain they couldn't fully understand, but could choose to honor. The next morning, Dr. Rebecca Foster sent an email to every member of the psychiatric department, every resident, every medical student rotating through Veterans Memorial Hospital. The subject line was simple: required reading, the case of James Sullivan. But it wasn't a case study in the traditional sense. It was a narrative, James's narrative, written with his permission and in his own words. It detailed the missions that never happened, the brothers who officially died elsewhere, the 50 years of classified grief, and the widow who had shared his burden until cancer claimed her. At the bottom of the narrative was a single question that Dr. Foster posed to everyone who read it. If your diagnostic tools cannot see this patient's truth, will you assume he is lying, or will you question whether your tools are sufficient?
He shared his story, yes, but more importantly, he taught them how to listen, how to hear what wasn't being said, how to recognize truth in its most uncomfortable forms, how to sit with pain they couldn't fix but could choose to witness. And in teaching them, something unexpected happened. James began to heal, not from his PTSD, which would always be part of him, not from his grief, which remained fresh and raw, but from the isolation, from the belief that his suffering had no purpose, from the weight of carrying Rodriguez's death in silence for half a century. The ghosts didn't disappear, they never would, but they became quieter, more manageable, less overwhelming, because James was no longer carrying them alone. He'd created a community of witnesses, young doctors who knew his truth, who believed his pain, who honored his sacrifice even when the official record denied it existed. On the anniversary of Rodriguez's death, officially a training accident at Fort Benning, actually a firefight in Laos, James sat in the hospital chapel. He wasn't religious, hadn't been since the jungle, but something about the quiet space felt appropriate. Dr. Foster found him there, sitting in the last pew, his gnarled hands folded in his lap. "You okay, James?" she asked gently, sliding into the pew beside him. "I was just thinking about Rodriguez, about how he died believing no one would ever know the truth, that his sacrifice would be classified into oblivion." He turned to look at Dr. Foster. "But now, because of what we're doing here, dozens of doctors know his name. They know how he died. They know he was a hero, even if the official record says otherwise." His voice cracked with emotion. "That's not nothing. That's not fixing what's broken, but it's something. It's memory. It's witness. It's making sure he didn't die for nothing, didn't disappear into nothing." Dr. Foster placed her hand over his weathered one. "You've given his death meaning, James. You've given all of their deaths meaning. Every student who learns from your story, every patient they treat with greater compassion because of what you've taught them, that's Rodriguez's legacy. That's Frank Morrison's legacy. That's yours." James nodded slowly, tears streaming down his face. Tears of grief, yes, but also of something that felt like peace, or at least the beginning of peace. The first tentative steps toward making his survival mean something beyond just enduring. "Catherine would be proud," he whispered. "Yes," Dr. Foster agreed, "she would be."
As evening settled over Veterans Memorial Hospital, James Sullivan sat in that quiet chapel, no longer alone with his ghosts. He carried them still, he always would, but now he carried them differently, with purpose, with meaning, with the knowledge that his invisible wounds had become a bridge of understanding for countless others. The missions would remain classified. The official records would never be corrected. Rodriguez would always be listed as having died in a training accident, Frank Morrison in a car crash, and dozens of others in the mundane ways that protected diplomatic relationships and preserved plausible deniability. But in the hearts and minds of the healers James had taught, the truth lived on. Not as classified intelligence or official history, but as something more powerful. As witnessed suffering transformed into wisdom. As invisible wounds made visible through courage. As one man's choice to let himself be seen so that others might finally be believed. And in the end, that was James Sullivan's real mission. Not the classified operations in jungles half a world away, not the impossible choices made in the darkness, but this, teaching a new generation of healers that the most important wounds are often the ones that leave no scars, that the deepest truths sometimes have no documentation, and that believing someone's pain, really believing it, is itself a profound act of healing. And perhaps, in some small way, that was how James finally came home from the war. Not by forgetting, not by healing, but by transforming his pain into purpose, his silence into teaching, his invisible wounds into a legacy of compassion that would outlive him and touch lives he would never know. The ghosts were still there. They always would be. But they were quieter now, gentler, less like attackers in the darkness, and more like old companions who had finally been acknowledged, finally been seen, finally been given the dignity of being remembered. And in that quiet chapel, as the last light of day surrendered to night, James Sullivan, veteran of wars that never officially happened, carrier of grief that was never supposed to exist, teacher of truths that couldn't be documented, finally allowed himself to believe that his survival had been worth it after all. Not because the pain had ended, but because it had found meaning. And sometimes that's the only victory that matters.